¿Le va a cortar con soso, punto y todo o todo lo que hacemos idealizar y ya después? No, te le voy a atravesar en la broca. Y ya, voy a marcar.
So these are the new blinds, half-inch mini blinds. This is the new window, which is installed in this wall. There's two defects in the glass, which is an optical defect apparently of the exterior pane, and so the center section is going to end up being replaced. Now, I talked with the window installer group, and what they found is that the people who did the actual installing were able to slide in 2x10 beam up here, and I can tell it's really solid. They were able to slide it in without removing any of the sheetrock. Now down below, I had cut this hole on the bottom, this hole on the bottom, and this hole in the middle. This was to determine where the wires from this outlet went, and they actually went down to the floor space below. So, and then I cut a hole here and on the opposite side to determine if to verify there's no wires in the way, and indeed there weren't. So here is a new stud that they put in, which starts, actually it starts way up here at the header and then goes down along the side of the window frame. And what I noticed when I looked at this hole I had cut, that there was a big gap here of absolutely no insulation. They basically just sort of stuffed the insulation to the side. They attached the stud to the adjoining stud and left this big gap of insulation. So I thought, well, if they pushed it aside at the bottom, they probably pushed it aside on the top too. And what I found as I went in here is there's this huge gap of insulation all along the stud. And as I feel up inside here, there's no insulation at all from the edge of the window till several feet appears in the other direction. So they screwed up the insulation envelope of this wall by the window installation. Now, I'm not planning on cutting more holes in the middle here, but they may have screwed up the insulation there too. As well, on this side, there's a big gap of no insulation between the stud and where this insulation is pushed aside. And when I reach up, the same thing, way over to here, the insulation is pushed off to the side. So there's no insulation on this entire space because they just sort of pushed it aside so they could do their work. So the advantage of having somebody come in to put in a window is they know what they're doing to install the window, but they just screwed up the entire wall for its insulation value. So now with these extra holes I put in, the top here. I'm going to try to stuff in, put in insulation and expand it to fill what they moved aside. But a nice looking window, but they screwed up the wall for its insulation value. Another factor with insulation is the vapor barrier. This wall originally had a continuous polyethylene vapor barrier covering the interior wall and sheetrock put on top of that. Now when I cut this hole, I've basically cut out the square of a vapor barrier, but as I'm feeling up here inside this hole, what I can find is that the vapor barrier is just sort of peeled back, and it's not attached at all to the window frame. So they took a continuous wall vapor barrier and just sort of disorganized it. There's sort of a sheet up here, but it's not attached to the new frame. It's just sort of hanging loose inside there. So I'm left with, okay, so what do? Just leave this insulation mess that they've created? Or really do a big job and take out this entire section of sheetrock and replace it later? It's just such a mess. So I cut an extra hole for exploration in the wall here, and as I felt upwards, I found there was no gap in the insulation except the vapor barrier was detached, not attached to the frame at all. So my assumption is that the vapor barrier is not adherent at all anywhere around the new window. And so my options are just fill in the insulation gaps, cover up the holes I've cut in the vapor barrier and put it back together again, or remove all the sheetrock from all the way around the window and try to make a good vapor barrier. So it's just a big mess. So I'll just fill in the insulation gaps and patch it up instead of trying to remove all the sheetrock and start the wall over again. It's just too much work. But nice looking window, but the insulation values are definitely compromised from what it was. And I knew it was going to be compromised because windows are not insulators very well, but they just, broke down the regular insulation that used to be in the wall. So what I did here is I took a 3.5 inch by 15 inch wide by 39 inch section and cut it in pieces side to side, and then I sort of stripped it to about half thickness, folded up a little bit, stuffed it in the hole, and try to slide it over and center it. So I did one section on the bottom, one section on the top, and then I slid another section the best I could down to here, and then another section in the middle. And so I've got 50% more insulation in this wall cavity, but it's probably not as evenly distributed as it would be if I didn't have the sheetrock in place. And then plus I'm going to have to patch up the vapor barrier, probably using a piece of radiant barrier, and try to tape it in place with aluminum tape. Anyway, that's what I'm trying to do to patch this together again for the insulation value. And I'll do that probably in the middle as well as on that end, and I'll leave the other two sections uncut and just leave them as is. So the vapor barrier would definitely be imperfect, but the insulation will be better than it was after the construction. So I'm trying to paste together the vapor barrier with pieces of self-adhesive aluminum tape and pieces of radiant barrier. Here I've got a piece of radiant barrier on the top, which I slid in behind the vapor barrier and then taped the vapor barrier to the radiant barrier. Same thing on the bottom, and then I'm just going to try to tape across this hole the best I can, and that's the best I can do. It's not as good as a continuous sheet vapor barrier stapled in place. It's just sort of pasted, patched together. But better than an open hole once I'm all done. And there it is, patched as good as I can. So patched vapor barrier, patched with radiant barrier and self-adhesive aluminum tape at each of these 6 holes, and hoping for the best because it's not sealed anywhere else around the window frame, vapor barrier that is, so it's as good as I can do, I guess, without tearing off the whole sheetrock. For the bottom 3 pieces, I cut these a month ago, and I think I discarded the pieces of sheetrock, so I'm going to have to cut out fresh pieces, but these were the ones that were originally in place. And I'll just, the backing boards are like 1x3s, held in place by 1 1/8 inch screws. Now I'm ready for the plastering. I guess I should point out, before I put in the extra insulation in these panels, through these panel openings, I did spread out the insulation that was there the best I could, but by that time it was pretty compressed. So I was adding extra insulation without really feeling like I was overstuffing it. First layer of plaster is on. Probably give it a day to dry. So these that show up color-wise have basically no significant texture difference. These are just marks, no texture difference. Same thing here, pretty smooth. It's again a mark there on the left, not a bump. Same here, no sign of the holes to speak of. Pretty smooth texture from the plastering and sanding. So the plaster and painting is now complete, and there's nothing for the camera to even lock onto hardly. Okay. And it looks basically really good in this area. It's smooth and even coloration. The only drawback is it's tough to see, but it even shows up in the camera. When you get about this point, this is where I stopped painting. This is a ultra pure white partial gloss, and this is not as pure white, less gloss, and older. So there is a potential job to do here, painting more of the room. I touched up here too, and the same thing as we get over here. There's a transition where I stopped. I had to move a bunch of furniture from the corner here to paint further. And once Laura notices it, maybe I'll be back doing this. But the plaster work and painting of this section is done, as well as painting the frame of the window, which is also done.